Did Serbs really need Yugoslavia? Was the creation of the common state of Serbs, Croats and Slovenes and the later Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia actually a mistake from the Serbian point of view? Many would claim that Serbia was, in many ways, better off on its own and shouldn't have fused its economical and political life with its neighbors to the west in the 20th century, or at the very least, shouldn't have given up its political supremacy over the other South Slavic constituents. The introductory video that poses this and many other questions related to the Yugoslav experience serves as a good starting point for understanding the relevance and importance of this discussion, and also introduces this exciting new series of videos. So in case you've missed it, feel free to take a look before watching this one. Nonetheless, over the course of the next few videos, we'll investigate the Serbian experience in relation to the Yugoslav experiment. In this one, we'll take a look at the fate of the Serbian people and their states in the medieval era. Then, in the following videos, we'll analyze the period under Ottoman and Habsburg occupation. Then, the Serbian national revival after 1804, their experiences in monarchist and socialist Yugoslavia, and round it off with a retrospective on the previous 30 years after the collapse of Yugoslavia. This all-encompassing historical analysis should then give us an answer to the burning question: did Serbs really need Yugoslavia? Now, historically, such disputes have always been resolved through actual wars and conflicts, which obviously have a lot of bad implications. Now imagine if we lived in a perfect world where such conflicts of interest could be resolved with all the thrilling aspects of combat, but where, nobody is actually harmed. Well, luckily, such a world already exists: the world of warships, the sponsor of today's video. I'm sure you've already heard about the legendary online multiplayer game of World of Warships, with hundreds of customizable warships and epic naval battles, packed up in an intense but relaxing strategic gameplay experience. What you probably didn't know is that the game is completely free to play, on both console and PC, and that by signing up with my link in the description or pinned comment below, you'll get a special starter pack worth $25 for free. And this means 500 doubloons, 2 million credits, a powerful tier 4 ship, 7 days of premium access, and 6 skill commander points to kickstart your epic campaign. So what are you waiting for? Hop on and play a few matches for some unforgettable fun and to directly support my channel with every game you play and every friend you invite over my link. Thank you to World of Warships for sponsoring, and now back to the video. Ever since their arrival to the Balkans, the unfortunate reality of all South Slavic peoples alike was that of fragmentation, subordination, and exploitation by great neighboring powers. The cooperation and socio-economic integration of their medieval states was directly prevented by the meddling of those same powers. A bulk of the cultural and linguistic heritage of all of our peoples alike, including the Serbs, was a result and remainder of centuries of imperial and colonial hegemony over the Serbian lands, with a brief period of some 2 centuries where Serbian statehood could opportunistically maintain relative autonomy and initiate cultural and economic revival up until the impending invasion and century-long occupation by the Ottoman Empire. The early medieval states of the South Slavs were an important element in their struggle for survival, and at the same time they greatly influenced the differentiation between them and the formation of larger ethnic units. The states played an important integrative role by gathering and connecting the Slavic population in a larger area, spreading the Slavic name within their borders, and creating conditions for cultural and linguistic equalization. When talking about Serbian history, one cannot omit the significance of surrounding states such as Duklja, Zeta, Travunija, and Zahumlje, which are more often than not considered to be a part of the constellation of medieval Serbian-oriented states, besides the traditional Serbian core known as Raška. These correlations were in the first line of a dynastical and political nature, with royal intermingling and intermarriage, whereas one can argue that the ethnic character of the population of these lands remains somewhat ambiguous. Many names, identifiers, and identities were used and spread among these scattered South Slavic domains, primarily including the early uses of the name Serbs for many of the tribes that lived there. This fragmentation across several different countries is somewhat of a foreshadowing for the future prospects of Serbian unity and statehood to this very day. Regardless, we should have our reservations when observing any sort of national sentiments and labels in the Middle Ages. One of the important differences between the history of the Serbian people in the Middle Ages and the new century is the change in the understanding of what we consider as Serbian people. Ordinary people, who make up the main part of the population, did not have headaches about that question. Until the time of the emergence of mass nationalism in the 20th century, ordinary people do not know what a people and a nation are, because no one has ever asked them about it. Only with the emergence of the idea of national sovereignty and the citizens' right to elect deputies to the freely elected parliament, the struggle over national identity will not become a general phenomenon. Regardless of this ambiguity, it's nonetheless impossible to ignore historical accounts, such as those of Konstantin Porphyrianitos, where he ties the arrival of Serbs to the Balkans to the following areas, besides the Serbian mainland. Zahumlje, which stretched along the coast from Dubrovnik towards the Neretva Valley, Travunije with Konavli, the coast of Boka Kotorska to Dubrovnik with the immediate hinterland, and Paganija, the coastal area between Neretva and Cetina, with the islands of Korčula, Mljet, Hvar, and Brač. As various Yugoslav sources remark about the ethnic composition of these territories, Travunjans and Konavljans were previously united and connected with the Serbian dynasty, so in the middle of the 10th century it was believed that they were descendants of Serbs. The Principality of Zahumlje, whose inhabitants in the 10th century were also counted as Serbs, led its independent policy, dictated by what seems to be the special interests of the dynasty. In the Serbian lands, almost the entire first half of the 12th century was filled with struggles for power in Zeta and the gradual rise of Raška and Bosnia. By the end of the 13th century, Zahumlje, Travunije, and Zeta had a stronger connection with the native Serbian lands. When it comes to Duklja, other Byzantine writers of the 11th and 12th centuries, apart from the name Diocletians and Serbs, also use old ethnic names from the pre-Slavic period, and some co-identify Serbs, i.e. Dukljans, and Croats, or talk about Duklja as a country where Croats live. Bosnia, covering medieval territories of Vrh Bosna, Hum, Zavrošje, Donji Kraj, Usora, and Soli, had essentially detached itself from the Serbian circle after the death of Jaroslav Vladimirović, and had shaped its own separate political life ever since, but was still shaped by a significant Serbian ethnic factor. Moreover, during the time of Kulin Ban, in Bosnia a new religious element penetrated, whose influence was fateful for the further religious development of this country. It was a dualist heretical movement, which by that time had spread and consolidated in a whole series of countries around the Mediterranean. This led to the eventual founding of the Bosnian Church, or Crkva Bosanska, in opposition to both Croatian Catholic and Serb Orthodox pressures. Because of this peculiar path of development, I'll dedicate only one small section to Bosnia during the time of Tvrtko Kotromanić, and leave the rest for another part of this series, where we delve into the history of Bosniaks before, during, and after Yugoslavia. That's where we'll concentrate on the multi-ethnic Bosnian state itself, whereas in this video we'll sporadically mention points relevant specifically to its Serbian Orthodox population. The same goes for Montenegro, which, despite its strong political, ethnic, and cultural ties with the Serbian people, was for the most part an entirely separate political subject with its own historical intricacies, which also deserve a video on their own. So, with all that cleared up and with this rudimentary understanding of the constellation of Serbian-oriented states, we can universally observe how the medieval states of the South Slavs were still not strong enough to be able to permanently resist the expansion of the neighboring states, which threatened them from many sides. Within such a constrained and divided Slavic world, there are very few traces of their formerly independent state development. The two great medieval empires, the Byzantine and the Frankish one, which were significantly different in their structure and civilizational flair, partially established rule over the Balkan Peninsula and drew parts of the South Slavs in dramatically different directions. These two magnates ended up creating and deepening the differences between them, which were initially no bigger than those among German or Italian tribes, which ended up developing into largely homogeneous nationalities. Compared to Croats and Slovenes, who were drawn towards Western cultural and political circles, the Serbs were primarily engulfed by the Byzantine cultural sphere. The very foundations of Serbian linguistics and literature arrived through Byzantium. In Byzantium, which was at that time very active towards the Slavic world, two scholars from Thessalonica were selected, Konstantin and his brother Methodius. The Thessalonica brothers created a new script, Glagolica, and translated some of the most important ritual documents. This laid the foundation of Slavic literature and opened entirely new possibilities for further cultural development of the Slavs. The first script, the Glagolitic one, was gradually pushed aside by the Cyrillic one, a more practical script created using Greek characters. When it comes to political influence, historical insights show us how those members of the Serbian dynasty who came to power with Bulgarian support in a short time turned to Byzantium, as if only the emperor's supreme power legalized their position. The rulers relied on the church, and state interests were identified with the churches. Christianity represented an element of connection and rapprochement, but on the other hand, it made it possible to cut deep and permanent borders between the South Slavic nations. Roman and Constantinople's ecclesiastical jurisdiction, Eastern and Western rites, different types of church organization met on Slavic soil and influenced their cultural and spiritual life for centuries. Altogether, there is no doubt that Byzantium wanted to consolidate its influence among the Serbian tribes by spreading Christianity. As nebulous of a term as it may be, medieval Serbia was a scattered place of many constantly changing rulers, tribes, borders, and systems, with political intricacies and intrigue that won't be the focus of this video. What we are interested in are the socio-economic relations of this general era, how society was organized, and how it functioned. Now, of the few things that we do know about the socio-economic situation of this period, it can be said that there was primarily a closed agrarian economy with very limited urban development in a select few privileged places. The beginnings of proto-feudalist relations introduced exploitation of the previously free peasantry to maintain state structures built upon the interests of the ruling class, which had developed from the ranks of tribal leaders and their military strongmen, with the titles of knez and župan, foreshadowing the beginnings of a new feudal class. According to European trends, free peasants were steadily entering a dependent and subordinate position vis-à-vis this proto-feudal aristocracy, through continuous enslavement and pressure, as a trade-off for quote-unquote protection by the nobles and the church. They were forced to give up part of their produce to the lords in the form of rabota. The main role in the very late arrival of non-agrarian economic centers in Serbia was played by foreigners, as they primarily populated the coastal towns of Dalmatia and gave them a Latin character, whereas the rural backwater was reserved for the Slavic Serbian peasantry. The steady rise of mercantile, artisan, and mining production influenced the functioning of political and state structures, better connection of territories, and better state integration. The parallel genesis of the nobility as a privileged class with immunity, power, and land, given by the ruler in exchange for their loyalty, only extended the universal exploitation of the lower classes. Progress in this sense was very slow and uneven, because forces in the direction of integration and those in the direction of separation were acting simultaneously. While some borders were fading and disappearing, others were just emerging or deepening. Apart from those moments of internal development, the process of strengthening the state, at least in the beginning, was conditioned and accelerated by constant struggles with Bulgaria and Byzantium, which also contributed to a faster and deeper splitting of society into antagonistic classes. Moreover, by the 12th century, the main focal point of anti-Byzantine struggle among Serbian dynasties had moved from Duklja to Raška. When it comes to the geopolitical position of the Serbian people, here we can already notice the beginnings of the precedent that haunted them throughout history. Serbs were surrounded from all sides and exposed to pressure from their neighbors. The Serbs stood in the direction of further Bulgarian expansion, so a collision was inevitable. The conquest of the First and Second Bulgarian empires, as well as the arrival of the Hungarians in the north, began to seriously challenge the declining Byzantine hegemon. Bulgarian expansionism from the 12th century onwards, combined with recurrent reconquistas coming from Byzantium, put Serbs into the crossfire and in a position of alternating subordination and repression by both powerful neighbors who relentlessly meddled in their internal affairs. Isolated and alienated from their Croatian and Slovene cousins by unfortunate historical circumstances, neither Serbs or their Slavic neighbors were able to maintain their statehood, borders, or cultural autonomy. But the further economic and political strengthening of the new feudal lords, their desire to establish their power as firmly as possible, and especially the rivalry between the members of the ruling family on the one hand, and the efforts of Byzantium and Bulgaria, who were fighting each other for supremacy in the Balkans, to impose their influence on Serbia, regularly through individual members of the ruling family on the other hand, they hindered and obstructed the process of strengthening and expansion of Serbia. The development of feudal relations and the strengthening of feudal exploitation caused internal disturbances. The rebellion of great lords, the peasants, and the resistance of the broad masses of people against feudalization, against the organization of the Bulgarian Orthodox Church, and against constant wars. And this resistance was manifested in the Bogomil movement. With such an unfortunate predicament since their arrival to the Balkans, from the perspective of the development of all South Slavic peoples alike, the most significant change was the sudden decline of Byzantine power and the disappearance of their immediate political pressure. What occurred as a result of this geopolitical vacuum is often described as the golden age of Serbian history, an unexpected turn of the tides that allowed Serbia to regain its sovereignty. The wars between Hungary and Byzantium, which were fought in several waves during the 12th century, had given the rulers of the Rashkan land the unique opportunity to rebel against the Byzantine emperors and invade the surrounding Byzantine territories. Within the framework of this Hungarian-Byzantine struggle, the founder of the most influential Serbian dynasty, Stefan Nemanja, had cleverly used the newly developing power relations to his advantage. Under Stefan Nemanja, the long struggle for Serbia's independence from Byzantium came to an end, and the expansion at the expense of Byzantium began, which will reach its culmination in Serbia's attempt to take its place. With significant struggles, a state was created that included areas where an independent political life had previously already been developed, and which had been under direct Byzantine rule for almost 2 centuries. The old principalities had their own special traditions, especially Duklja, so Nemanja's creation was an insufficiently connected whole that was in danger of falling apart. At the time when, after the conquest of Constantinople, the Westerners penetrated the Byzantine world, Serbia ensured state independence by declaring a kingdom and establishing an autocephalous archbishopric. In the process of proto-national integration of Serbian regions, the creation of a special church organization made it possible to connect the parts of the state of the Nemanjići more tightly, and over time, to merge them into one whole. In Serbia, the activity of the church had an important integrative function, which was more pronounced here due to the very early creation of the cult of the founder of the independent state and the church of Saint Simeon or Stefan Nemanja and of Saint Sava, which was later joined by the cult of some other holy rulers. Through them, the political history of the Serbian state became part of the church's own tradition, which later enabled the church to preserve the continuity of historical consciousness, so important for the maintenance of the Serbian people in the period of foreign rule. Despite being very outdated amidst modern historiography, the accounts of Vladimir Perović from the 1920s nonetheless recognize a crucial point about the often misunderstood national content of Nemanjić rule. The feeling of national unity at that time was still fragile, not only amongst the masses but also among many people at the top. So accordingly, the old struggles like those between Raška and Zeta, that is, between Catholicism and Orthodoxy among the Serbs themselves, would still be possible. Sava strove, in the spirit of the ideas of his era, to achieve a closer bond between Serbian regions and tribes through religious unity, and thus achieve complete homogeneity of the Serbian state. He brought our two areas, which have been at odds with their different cultures for a very long time, but with basically the same people, into a closer union. Nonetheless, the conditions had ripened through decades of Nemanjić dynasty rulers, and eventually bore fruits in an unprecedented expansion of the Serbian borders under Stefan Dušan, whose war machine swiftly conquered Byzantine lands that were engulfed in the disarray of civil war, and lifted Serbia to the rank of empire, something that modern Serbs love to reminisce about as the golden age of Serbian power. However, this fundamentally unstable and unsustainable creation, born from the opportunistic conquest by the Serbian ruling class, was only of peripheral importance for the everyday well-being of the actual peasant population that lived there. Now, since the Nemanjić dynasty is praised and romanticized without end in modern Serbia, let's take a sober but concise look at how Serbian society actually looked like back in the day. By the middle of the 14th century, feudalism was completely established in Serbia, with an already established class division characteristic of a class society. The free peasants have almost completely disappeared. In Serbia, the majority of power was in the hands of the nobility and the clergy, and the peasants were more and more oppressed with each passing day. The foundation of the ruler's power were hereditary possessions. Therefore, the sovereign's right to heritage is especially protected. The nobles could receive from the ruler cities, parishes, or larger areas to be governed, i.e., given the right to exercise administrative authority in them and to take some part of the income that belonged to the ruler. Political rights belonged at that time only to ecclesiastical and secular feudal lords, who gathered at state assemblies and on various other occasions. The basis of state organization was represented by feudal manors, which were not only independent economic organizational units, but also independent administrative and judicial units. They were, as it is said in some documents, self-governing and under self-jurisdiction. These socio-economic developments were, among all Yugoslav peoples alike, flowing in the same direction as those of Western Europe, although to different extents and levels, and under the influences of various feudal traditions and setups. In Serbian populated areas, it was of course primarily the heritage of Byzantine feudalism. These ever-growing feudal properties were, in essence, exploited for the needs of the monastery nobility, the extravagance of the royal court, the army and mercenaries, and the general needs of the subjugated population. The development of cities was very slow, and the economy maintained a mainly agricultural character. Craftsmanship was developing parallel to the needs of agriculture, whereas the mining sector was steadily becoming the main source of Serbian economic growth, which all in tandem meant an increase in mercantile trade and commodity exchange, primarily with Dubrovnik and Venice. This undisputable economic growth allowed for an ever more active foreign policy. Strengthening their central authority, the Nemanjići tried to limit the independence of the feudal lords as much as possible, and narrow the circle of their authority. And what did this centralization concretely mean? Well, in medieval Serbia, no distinction was made between state property and the ruler's private property. All state revenues, which were collected in the form of various taxes and levies, went to the ruler's personal treasury, which at the same time was considered the state treasury. By the time of Stefan Dušan, state and class structures had strengthened to a previously unseen extent. The main task of Dušan's code was to consolidate the high position and many privileges of lords and rulers, to legalize their quote-unquote right to exploit and keep the working masses in dependence and submission, and also to consolidate Dušan's vast state. So, as celebrated, mythologized, and romanticized as the Nemanjić dynasty and their glorious successes and conquests may be among contemporary Serbs, none of the erected monasteries, ancient flags, proclaimed saints, preserved traditions, or cultural heritage can erase the fact that this state was, as others of its time, an exploitative class creation, with all its mechanisms working against its inhabitants and solely for the interests of the tiny minority of royals and nobles at the very top, some of which we've lifted to the rank of actual saints. Besides the undeniable successes in achieving cultural, literary, and religious autonomy and emancipation, while resisting foreign powers, Serbian peasants had very little material gain from Nemanjić expansionism whatsoever. With its unsustainable foundations, it could only temporarily postpone the Turkish onslaught that came merely a century later. These fundamental mechanics of feudal class society can help us shed light onto the reason why, despite the denial of modern personality cults and mythology, Dušan's empire wasn't a divinely mandated display of Serbian superiority, but was doomed to fail all along. Why? Well, within the empire, central state power was dependent on the loyalties of the nobility and feudal lords, which were of ethnically mixed character, including Serbs, Albanians, and Greeks. Their lack of loyalty amidst growing particularist ambitions to locally rule isolated areas of the empire inevitably turned into rebelliousness after Stefan Dušan's death. Combined with the inability of his successor Uroš to manage the marauding nobles, their ceaseless infighting overshadowed any glimmer of national consciousness, which was, with the trends of its time, already standing on shaky legs. With such an unstable political constellation, it was only a matter of time when Dušan's territorial gains would shatter to pieces. With the death of Dušan's son, Emperor Uroš I, the rule of the Nemanjić dynasty will end in Serbian lands. A period of 2 centuries will end, during which Nemanja and his successors, the Nemanjići, successfully overcoming internal crises and external pressures, created a strong political community of the Serbian people. The Nemanjić state, elevated to the rank of an empire in the middle of the 14th century, acquired a decisive role in the political life of the Balkan Peninsula. The rise of Serbia and the brilliant development of Serbian culture and art, based on the Byzantine heritage and widely open to the best achievements of the Western world, were achieved by the consistent policy of the Nemanjić dynasty. They enriched the neglected and disconnected areas with cultural centers introduced the Serbian people to the economic, political, and spiritual currents of their time. But despite all of these integrative achievements, the upcoming period of decline had revealed an abundance of cracks whose reality is, to many, very hard to swallow. Internal divisions and conflicts have made the crisis of the Serbian people and their country especially serious and deep. With the disappearance of the empire after the death of Dušan and then Uroš, many large and small feudal lords, the Serbian nobility or great men as they are remembered by folklore, threatened the unity and continuity of Nemanjić statehood with a fight for petty personal and regional interests. Among the leading aristocratic families with clearly defined interests, the determination of one's own policy did not always lead to one singular goal. Many lords developed a mercenary mentality. They turned to whoever could offer a better deal. What does national feeling even mean to such people? Well, it means that class interests were more important than national defense from the looming Ottoman threat to the east, which set the Serbian people for disaster. The short-lived empire was fragmented into dozens of tiny states ruled as private fiefdoms, which were ready to be snatched by the incoming Ottoman invaders. On the other side of the Drina River, though, the reign of Bosnian king Tvrtko I Kotromanić was in its full swing, compounding on decades of Bosnian statist traditions quite independent from Serbian dynasties. In 1377, Tvrtko I Kotromanić was crowned as the king of Serbia. However, as the ruler of the then heretical Bosnia, which had its own independent Bosnian church intertwined with many Catholic and Orthodox inhabited areas, his religious and political principles were very different from those of the charismatic Nemanjić. Medieval Bosnia was, accordingly, not developing as a homogeneous tribal or national state, as were Raška and Croatia, for example. One of the main factors of this heterogeneity was the fact that it geographically lays at the very crossroads between the eastern and western imperial and cultural zones, so its population included both Orthodox and Catholic Christians, retroactively viewed as Serbs and Croats, and the endogenous Bosnian heretics known as Kršćani. So, as both Serbian and Croatian statehood were in many ways struggling to stay afloat by the end of the 14th century, the Bosnian conception realized through Tvrtko was very conscious and progressive for its time, and held a pivotal position among the Serbo-Croatian people. If we were to draw a parallel between their proto-national conceptions, Stefan Dušan of Serbia was aiming to create a Serbo-Byzantine empire, whereas Tvrtko Kotromanić of Bosnia was inconspicuously building a Serbo-Croatian state. Overall, medieval Bosnian statehood was built upon its predicament in relation to larger powers, which has in essence stayed the same to this very day. It was fateful for Bosnia that the Croatian state was merged with Hungary at the beginning of the 12th century. Bosnia got a powerful country as its neighbor, whose rulers and feudal lords, especially later on, taking advantage of the religious opportunities in it, constantly tried to bring it under their rule as much as possible. So, whilst Croatia and Serbia were respectively succumbing to their occupiers from the west and south respectively, Bosnia had tactically managed to temporarily cement its position as a stronghold against foreign hegemony, always finding ways to subdue Hungarian pressures. Nonetheless, to the southeast, the gradual process of vassalization, subordination, and exploitation of the scattered Serbian and other Balkan peoples' lands by the Ottoman invaders had already begun. The main aspiration of the Turks was to take full advantage of this multitude of small Christian states in the Balkans. The most important task of the Turkish border commanders was to sow discord among the Christian rulers, to prevent the creation of larger units, and thus to prepare the land for conquest. Although in chaos, Serbian rulers and their armies had fought back valiantly for almost a century after the infamous Battle of Marica, but ultimately to no avail. The aforementioned Battle of Marica and the Battle of Kosovo have stayed in collective consciousness as tragic breaking points, which grew into myth and legend. During the 70 years between the Battle of Kosovo and the Ottoman capture of Smederevo in 1459, medieval Serbia managed to survive and even prosper despite a difficult predicament. Rather than an aspiring and territorially almost constantly expanding regional power of the Nemanjić era, the Serbia of the despots shifted between Ottoman and Hungarian vassalage, managing to preserve a level of self-rule and influence regional affairs. Attempts of the likes of Lazar Hrebljanović, Despot Stefan, Đurađ Branković, and Kraljević Marko, often through Turcophilic and Hungarophilic politics, to re-scramble the feudal ruins and re-centralize state power ultimately failed, after a decade-long scramble to avoid disaster and reconsolidate Serbian statehood. Further south from the Serbian Despotate, Macedonian and Serbian lands were first in line to be incorporated into the empire and turned into sanjaks or vassalized, followed by the fall of Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Zeta. All of these provinces and states saw the same pattern of increasing inner antagonisms as a result of rapid feudalization. Ever since the Battle of Kosovo, Serbia has been squeezed between the Ottoman power, which was persistently in various ways expanding in the south, and Hungary, which was attacking from the north. Turkish and Hungarian armies often competed with each other in Serbia and made the evil of the post-Kosovo years even deeper. The position of the dependent peasants, even in the years where there were no war ravages, became more and more difficult because the duties and taxes increased. With the development of the commodity money economy, the demands of the feudal lords, nobles, and the church grew, and agriculture, due to the ravages of war and the reduction in the number of dependent peasant farmers, gave less and less. The tribute to the Turks, which was paid by Stefan Lazarević and the Brankovići, also fell on the backs of the primary producer. The small Balkan world, primarily the peasants, suffered tremendously due to the chaos created around the Turkish borders and the conflicts between the lords, so they often saw the Turkish government as salvation from their miseries and troubles. In the regions possessed by the Turks, there was indeed an economic calm. People were freed of worries about basic sustenance and everyday uncertainties. On the other hand, robberies, military campaigns, and conquests created economic chaos, broke the established framework of the Balkan states, destroyed the established social and political order, and caused major demographic changes. So, summing up our predicament of the Middle Ages, we can see that, time and time again, the class-oriented Serbian nobility, feudal lords, and rulers have in the long run proven that both in success and ruin, they have been incapable of withstanding the immense pressures from more powerful civilizations from all sides, the Byzantines, Hungarians, Bulgarians, or Ottomans. Parallel struggles and failures of the Croatian, Slovenian, and Bosnian ruling lords and nobles to maintain their individual sovereignties faltered in the same way under Austrian, Hungarian, and Venetian pressures, leading them into an equally subordinate position like the Serbs. In the midst of these historical tragedies, however, there are several moments that documented their sense of community and the need to support each other. These are joint uprising against the Obar oppressors, Ljudevit's resistance against the Franks, their appreciation of Slavic service, Croats helping the Serbs in the fight against the Bulgarians, connections between the Macedonian Slavs and Zechans in the fight against the Greeks, the movement of Croats and Slovenes against the Germans. Later, the more the state life and state politics of individual tribes have developed, those ties, if not entirely weakened, have become less prevalent. So, that's about it when it comes to medieval Serbian history before Yugoslavia. Stay tuned for part 2, where we'll take a look at the period of Serbian life and struggles between the Ottoman and Habsburg empires. Thank you for watching, and thank you again to World of Warships for sponsoring this video. By playing a few matches through the link down below, you directly support the channel and make content like this possible. Have fun and stay tuned.